Around midday on December 22, 1944, General der Panzertruppen Hinrich von Lüttwitz stood inside a drafty Belgian farmhouse converted into a command post. Outside, the winter wind swept across the fields west of Bastogne, carrying with it the distant thunder of artillery. Inside, von Lüttwitz stared at a map spread across a rough wooden table, its markings, unit symbols, and colored arrows showing something that should have been impossible. The map showed American positions where no American units should have been. According to every principle of military movement he had studied in more than 2 decades of service, the Americans on that map could not exist. 3 days earlier, von Lüttwitz commanded the German XLVII Panzer Corps as it spearheaded the southern thrust of Germany's Ardennes offensive. His armored and infantry formations had completed a textbook encirclement of the American 101st Airborne Division inside the small road junction town of Bastogne. 7 critical roads converged there, meaning whoever held Bastogne controlled the flow of movement through the Ardennes. He had 15,000 soldiers, 45 tanks, and a ring of steel around a starving, undermanned American force. The Americans inside had perhaps 6,000 effectives, low on ammunition, dangerously low on medical supplies, with no armor support and no viable route for relief. The position was hopeless. Von Lüttwitz had already sent a surrender demand to the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. The reply came back with a single, almost comical word, nuts. Von Lüttwitz had not been amused, but he had not been overly concerned either. His staff estimated Bastogne would fall within 48 hours. It was not arrogance, it was doctrine. Surrounded forces without reinforcement or resupply typically collapsed within 2 to 3 days. And for several days, winter weather prevented Allied air resupply. The Americans were trapped, and time was on the German side. But now, on December 22, the map showed American Third Army units approaching from the south, moving far faster than should have been possible. Von Lüttwitz knew exactly where the U.S. Third Army had been, over 150 kilometers away near the German border, engaged in heavy operations around Saarbrücken. No army, especially not an American army with enormous logistical requirements, could disengage from major offensive operations, pivot 90 degrees, and rush north through winter-choked roads in just a few days. Military doctrine demanded 1 to 2 weeks for such a maneuver, and von Lüttwitz knew doctrine better than most. His entire career had been shaped by studying logistics, the science that dictated what armies could and could not physically do. And yet here the Americans were, violating every principle he considered absolute. The Third Army was commanded by Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., and von Lüttwitz was beginning to understand why German generals who had fought Patton before warned that this American fought a different kind of war. The first German officer to warn him had been Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the elite Panzer Lehr Division. Von Lüttwitz had known Bayerlein since North Africa and Russia. They were comrades, trained in the same schools, shaped by the same doctrine. In August 1944, Bayerlein's Panzerlehr was one of the finest German units in the field. Experienced crews, full equipment strength, and a reputation for discipline and tactical excellence. The division had conducted a skillful, textbook mobile defense across France after D-Day, trading space for time, preserving combat power, and withdrawing before encirclement, exactly as German doctrine prescribed. Bayerlein had every reason to believe he could slow Patton with the same well-tested method. But when Patton's Third Army broke out of Normandy, nothing behaved the way German doctrine predicted. Operation Cobra unleashed an American advance that refused to follow the expected operational rhythm. At every point where Bayerlein anticipated a pause, where any normal army would consolidate, secure supply lines, or bring up reserves, Patton's forces simply kept moving. On August 1st they pierced German lines. On August 2nd they were 30 kilometers deeper. On the third day 40. By August 4th, American armored columns were 60 kilometers behind where German intelligence said they should be. In just 72 hours, Bayerlein's carefully prepared defensive belts were bypassed, his withdrawal routes severed, and his reserve forces cut off. The Panzer Division was not destroyed through overwhelming firepower. It simply disintegrated because German units could not reposition fast enough to respond to Patton's operational tempo. Bayerlein later admitted that fighting Patton felt like facing a completely different army from the one he had battled elsewhere. The British under Montgomery advanced methodically, allowing German defenses time to flex and adjust. The Americans under Bradley generally followed predictable doctrine. But Patton operated outside every rhythm German intelligence relied upon. His forces appeared in places they should not have reached, at speeds German planners believed impossible. And Bayerlein was not the only one. The second warning von Lüttwitz received came from General der Panzertruppen Walter Kruger, commander of the LVII Panzer Corps. Kruger had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He understood armored warfare intimately. In September 1944, his corps defended the Moselle River line in eastern France, a formidable natural barrier. Military textbooks insisted an attacker required a 3-to-1 manpower advantage to force a river crossing. Patton did not have it. Doctrine said such an operation required days of reconnaissance, artillery preparation, and carefully coordinated assaults. Patton went anyway. On September 6th, barely a day after reaching the river, American forces crossed, immediately, in multiple locations, using anything that floated, including improvised rafts and captured German gear. Instead of massing at one crossing site, they broke through everywhere, overwhelming German reserves before they could redeploy. Within 4 days, the Moselle line, expected to hold for weeks, collapsed. Kruger wrote later that Patton's forces operated on different planning timelines than any other Allied army. Patton created his own favorable conditions through speed and surprise, compressing operations that should have taken days into mere hours. Similar reports spread across the Western Front. German infantry commanders in Lorraine and Alsace consistently reported that American Third Army units advanced 2 or 3 times faster than projections. Defensive plans that assumed days of preparation unraveled because Patton's forces arrived sometimes 48 hours earlier than the earliest possible estimate. All of it pointed to the same problem. German doctrine, effective, proven, precise, did not work against Patton. He simply moved too fast for doctrine to matter. Von Lüttwitz, a meticulous planner by nature, tried to understand the phenomenon through logistics, the fundamental engine of all modern warfare. He calculated, quite correctly, that an American armored division required roughly 300 tons of supplies each day to maintain offensive operations. These supplies traveled hundreds of kilometers from Normandy over battered roads. Trucks could only go so far in a day. Maintenance slowed things further. Weather slowed them even more. Under ideal conditions, American divisions should have advanced no more than 20 to 25 kilometers per day. That was the hard physical limit. But Patton's divisions were advancing 40, sometimes 50 kilometers. The numbers did not add up. Either American supply efficiency was far beyond German estimates, or Patton was deliberately violating logistical doctrine. The more intelligence von Lüttwitz reviewed, especially from Sicily, the more obvious the answer became. Patton was indeed violating doctrine. He simply valued speed more than supply security, accepting the constant risk of outrunning his logistical tail. German intelligence noted case after case in which Patton's units literally ran out of fuel mid-operation, then resumed as soon as trucks caught up. Reckless, by traditional standards, but devastatingly effective. When Patton's forces reached the fortified city of Metz in late 1944, German commanders finally witnessed a situation where his speed could not help him. Metz was surrounded by 43 massive forts, concrete and steel monsters stretching back to the 1870s. Patton believed the city would fall quickly. He was wrong. The first assaults failed catastrophically. The forts resisted artillery, resisted bombing, and turned American attacks into blood-soaked stalemates. For once, German defensive doctrine worked. Months passed. The siege dragged into November. Rain, mud, and fuel shortages slowed every operation. But even here, Patton's method revealed its adaptability. While one of his corps besieged Metz, he used the other to bypass it entirely, maintaining momentum elsewhere. By the time Metz finally surrendered in mid-December, Patton was already shifting his attention eastward. But events elsewhere were about to change everything. On December 16, 1944, the German army launched its last major offensive of the war, the Ardennes counteroffensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. German forces smashed through thin American lines, creating a massive bulge on Allied maps. Bastogne became the focal point. Surrounded, cut off, and freezing, the 101st Airborne resisted stubbornly, but their situation was dire. When Eisenhower convened his generals on December 19, he asked Patton the same question that had astounded von Lüttwitz. How soon could Third Army stop its offensive, turn 90 degrees, and attack north to relieve Bastogne? Patton's answer came instantly: 48 hours. The room reportedly erupted in disbelief. It should have been impossible. But Patton's staff had already written contingency plans, 3 of them, before the meeting. The moment Eisenhower gave the order, Patton issued verbal commands that afternoon, confirmed them later in writing, and unleashed one of the fastest operational pivots in modern military history. He did everything doctrine said not to do. He moved combat units ahead of logistics. He used multiple roads at once, creating deliberate congestion to move more units in parallel. He delegated problem-solving authority downward. He accepted chaos so long as momentum continued. Doctrinally, dangerously reckless. Operationally, brilliant. Thus, on December 22, the very morning von Lüttwitz studied his impossible map, Patton's lead elements were already hammering German positions south of Bastogne. The German timetable collapsed. Instead of isolating and destroying the 101st Airborne, von Lüttwitz now faced the very real possibility of his own forces being encircled. The situation no longer favored the Germans. Patton had stolen time, something the German plan could not compensate for. And on December 26, the siege of Bastogne was broken. After the war, German officers repeatedly emphasized that Patton's greatest weapon was not firepower, not armor, not numbers, but speed. Montgomery destroyed German forces through overwhelming set-piece operations. Bradley wore them down methodically. Patton shattered them through dislocation, by moving so quickly that German officers could not coordinate, could not reorganize, could not even understand the battlefield before it changed again. Entire corps found themselves outflanked not because of mistakes, but because Patton moved faster than they thought was physically possible. This phenomenon continued into 1945. When the Allies approached the Rhine, the last great natural defensive barrier of Germany, Montgomery prepared a massive, meticulously planned offensive with thousands of guns and airborne operations. Patton, meanwhile, told Bradley he could take the Rhine on the run. And he did. On March 22, 1945, at Oppenheim, Patton launched a crossing with minimal preparation, under darkness, using whatever resources were at hand. German defenders were caught completely off guard. By the time Montgomery's massive offensive began the next day, Patton was already across with armor pouring into southern Germany. The contrast between the two approaches became legendary. Both succeeded. But Patton succeeded first. German commanders acknowledged the crossing as one of the most professionally executed river assaults of the war. And Patton, never one to hide his satisfaction, famously urinated into the Rhine, his own flamboyant punctuation mark on a maneuver that symbolized everything the Germans feared about him: speed, audacity, and utter disregard for limitations others accepted as normal. As Third Army swept into southern Germany, German resistance fragmented. Patton's divisions bypassed strongholds, cut communications, isolated entire armies, and triggered cascading collapses. Surrender rates soared because German units often found themselves surrounded before they realized Patton's forces were even in the area. By the end of the war, no Allied field army had inflicted more disintegration on German forces than Patton's. In post-war interviews, German officers were asked to evaluate the Allied commanders they had faced. They praised Montgomery for professionalism, Bradley for systematic competence, but when asked which commander they feared, the answer was nearly unanimous: Patton. Not because he was reckless, though he was. Not because he had superior equipment, though American material was formidable. But because Patton's operational tempo rendered German doctrine irrelevant. They feared him because speed, relentless, unpredictable, overwhelming speed, made their carefully crafted plans meaningless. General von Lüttwitz himself summarized the German perspective. Patton understood, perhaps better than any Allied commander, that modern war was about collapsing the enemy's ability to respond. He created chaos while maintaining coherence within his own army. He gave the Germans no time to reposition, no time to fortify, no time to counterattack. Without time, even the best doctrine crumbled. Over and over again, from Sicily to France to the Ardennes to the Rhine, the same pattern repeated. Patton's armies arrived earlier than expected, struck sooner than expected, and achieved objectives faster than expected. German generals feared him not because he was the perfect commander, but because he turned the battlefield into something they could not control. That was the reason Patton became the Allied commander German generals feared most. Not the most cautious, not the most politically reliable, not even the most tactically precise, but the one whose methods consistently broke their armies faster than they could adapt. Patton's legacy rests on this reality. His armies didn't just win battles, they destroyed the enemy's ability to fight at all. And in the final calculus of war, nothing mattered more.